Good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully, it was quite a big lunch, wasn't it? I don't know about yourselves. It was quite a big lunch, and we've got to be careful. This is the danger session. Last year, we had someone, unfortunately, fell off their chair during one of the sessions, and everyone panicked, and of course, she fell asleep. So she was fine, but you know, look at your partner. If you see the eyes starting to move, don't be afraid to just give them a little slight nudge to stay with the program. But we'll be testing, we'll be watching. Thanks for coming to this session. This is something when we were thinking about Talent Connect that we felt was really of an area that really was a lot of interest to a lot of our clients, and I think there is a significant amount of really interesting and exciting things happening, you know, in the space of diversity and inclusiveness. They're quite broad topics actually when you actually look into the subject matter, and I'm really excited with the guests that we have here today. I was hoping that the slide would be up that would actually show their name. Here we are on cue, isn't that nice? And so one of the things when we sort of spoke as a group as to how to really think about this, we've really broken it out into some nice, really interesting areas, from Indigenous to inclusiveness as well as to gender. And then we'll finish with a bit more of a broader discussion. My experience, I suppose, started in diversity some time ago, and I got involved in a really unique campaign prior to actually joining LinkedIn, where a manufacturer was really looking to attract more females into that kind of workforce. And it really taught me the art of effective communication when you were looking at that sort of niche talent, in particular when it came to gender. And that's really sort of spurred my interest into this area. Jim, I'm really going to open up with yourself here to start things off. I think Indigenous is an area that more and more people are seeing as being critical to a part of the Australian workforce that perhaps hasn't been tapped very well. And I feel that there is a lot of people who perhaps don't really understand how to be really effective when it comes to Indigenous recruiting. Before we go into that, perhaps a little bit of background to your company and actually the role AIME is actually playing with the Indigenous talent today.
Yeah, sure. I'm Gemma. I'm from AIME, or the Australian Indigenous Mentoring Experience. I'm wearing actually one of our more subtle uniforms today. We usually rock around in very bright, quite offensive hoodies that are very comfortable. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Gadigal people or the Grasstree people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and I think really importantly from AIME's point of view, the future, because that's what we're working towards. We're working towards a radical idea of equality in education across all students. So we work with Indigenous high school kids. We couple them with university mentors. Currently we're working with 3,500 Indigenous high school kids around Australia and 1,200 university students. We've got a solid team of 100 across all mainland states and the ACT, working in partnerships with 16 Australian universities, with corporates. I know some of the Virgin team are here today with some fantastic corporates partners, LinkedIn one of them, philanthropics and a lot of in-kind support. We're working towards, in 2016, 10,000 kids. We've done really well. For those of you that don't know, Indigenous education is an area that, there's some real discrepancies. So from the year 9 to year 12 completion rates for Indigenous high school kids are 38%. If you compare them with the non-Indigenous statistics, it's 79.9%. If you run through the AIME program, we significantly close that gap and the chance of finishing school is 71.9%. And just a little side note for people in the room, or some exciting news coming out, we have our 2013 report being released in a couple of weeks, and we're looking to well and truly smash that gap. So that's a little bit about us. There's lots of opportunities for individuals and corporates to get involved. If you want to come and have a chat, that's my little very subtle plug just there.
It's a good one though.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's who we are and what we do, and obviously diversity is hugely important to us. As an organisation, it's one of the first things we talk to kids about, that there's no one identity around being Indigenous, and for us there's no one way of being the perfect AIME employee. We want people from all backgrounds or genders to make sure that we're hitting those 10,000 kids and we're making the most significant closing of the gap in Australia's history.
Yeah, I think when we were talking prior, I think you said there's 100 people in your organisation?
Yes, we've got 100 staff members.
And what percentage of that would be Indigenous talent working for your company?
Yeah, so about 47% of our staff are Indigenous working around Australia. In terms of how we get them on board, or how we sort of make sure that there's a real inclusiveness in our organisation, one of the things that we absolutely hammer with staff is that we're a safe space that you can ask any questions. We've got some people that are first generation Australian. We have one girl that works for us who's only been in Australia for a couple of months, and she doesn't, she might not understand what it is to be an Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander, but she doesn't need to. AIME is a safe space where we can have those conversations, where we can celebrate identity and who we are as individuals and who we are collectively.
Yeah, I think that a lot of organisations are really focusing on recruiting Indigenous talent. That's a very high percentage that you have, which is fantastic. Is there any kind of insights or tips that perhaps that someone is looking at perhaps getting an Indigenous program or wants to recruit more Indigenous talent into their organisation? Are there things that you could share that might help with the awareness and education to sort of be more effective with that?
Sure. We're really lucky to have sort of, we recruit like all of you do. We want the best people for the job in the role, and we just happen it, and very fortunate that the number of people that come into our organisation that fit in different diversity groups just makes up a nice collective family. In terms of, I think, when you are looking to recruit any group, there's sort of the 3 stages: the recruitment stage, the induction stage, and then that retention, that all important, particularly when I'm Gen Y, so retaining me is always a challenge. But if you look at recruitment, the biggest sort of thing that we do is we are very present in the community. So it's about getting out to NAIDOC weeks coming up. If it's something you're looking at doing, getting a stall at NAIDOC week, throwing on a barbecue is really important. That presence and that knowledge that people know you, there's a real sort of connection to who do you know, and that sort of follows on to the second big thing, and that's the referral system. We were having a think about it before. We've got about 1/3 of our staff that have come through referrals. Listening to Ed talk this morning, it would be so awesome if we could offer sort of monetary incentives. Being a not-for-profit, we don't have that opportunity, but we're really fortunate that staff are really keen to get people involved that they think would be good for the organisation. We've had great success with our referral system. So that's the big one. Getting an Indigenous ambassador on board is one way to do that, and making sure you have someone that's Indigenous in your recruitment team is a really helpful tool as well. So there's sort of 2 things. In terms of induction, again, that sort of safe space. We have an Indigenous buddy system where we buddy up to Indigenous staff member. We also have a formal internal mentoring system to make sure people feel really welcomed and can have those that ask questions that maybe you're not comfortable asking in a larger forum. And then with retention, for us, it's about training and development, having open conversations with our CEO quarterly, which can sometimes be sort of, he's often put in a difficult position, but he's always pretty frank and honest with his responses, and just making sure that people are as supported and as developed and as trained as possible so that they feel included in our little community.
Yeah, terrific. And I think one of the key takeaways for me around that is that when we talk about branding and effective communication, it really is going out into the community. So thanks, Gem, for sharing those insights. Finuala, our international guest, welcome from Singapore. Really pleased to have you here. I enjoyed spending time with Finuala and getting to learn more about SAP, and I learned from that they have a very strong inclusiveness program. When we spoke, you sort of inspired that how you really had changed your approach to that. Is there anything you can share with the group about that program?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. We've had a program running in our Indian Labs organisation for a number of years, and it's our developers teaching parents and teachers of autistic children how to use tablets for education. It led us to really investigate a little bit more around the inclusive topic and where there were potential untapped talent pools that we could look into. We came to connect with an organisation called Specialist Stern. Specialist Stern is Danish for the specialist. And it was set up by an amazing consultant called Torkel's son. Torkel had a son who was diagnosed with autism when he was 3. And when we met with Torkel, we were asking, how did you set up this organisation? Where did the idea come from? And he started to tell us a story about a road trip that he'd been on with his family. Road trips we've all done heaps of times with the family. His son was in the back of the car, and his son was intently studying the map. He didn't think anything of it. His son became very focused on anything which took his attention at that particular time. He came home from work a couple of days later, and he found a piece of paper that his son had been working on, drawing on. Picked it up, had a look at this, and it was the exact replica of the map that his son had been studying. He had done this completely from memory, and Torkel, of course, checked it. Being a consultant, he was into detail. He checked it, and it was 100% accurate. Every single data point was correct. And his son was only like a really young kid at the time. Thorkel started to think about this and investigate a little bit more in terms of the special traits or skills that people with autism, or many people with autism, have. And he looked into this, and there were some traits that really stood out to him, such as amazing powers of concentration when absorbed in a task, really highly structured thought process, the ability to complete repetitive tasks with a very high level of accuracy. And he started to think about this from a commercial aspect, and also pinning back to his son, what were the employment opportunities which were going to be available to his son when he was ready to enter the workforce? So he set up Specialist Stern, which is an amazing organization, socially innovative company, where the majority of employees have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. Completely unique organization out there. And what he did was looking at harnessing the special skills of people with autism to give companies a competitive edge or competitive advantage, while also providing long-term employment opportunities for people with autism. So we started to investigate this in more detail and say, well, is there any opportunity for SAP to partner with Specialist Stern? And we went into it in a lot more detail. There were clear synergies between the skills that were available and software development. If you think of writing a software program, I mean, it's written in a highly structured fashion. For people with autism to be able to identify potential errors in data or pick up errors in pattern of code, huge skill set. So we started to look into this in more detail, and we decided to embark on a program, which I'm really happy to talk about, which is called Autism at Work. We made the commitment last year, we announced it in May of last year, that we're going to hire 1% of our workforce from people who have a diagnosis on the autism spectrum by 2020. Now, if you think of the size of SAP, we've got now over 67,000 employees globally, so it's a significant portion of the population. So we did the pilot in Ireland, I was delighted to say, did the pilot in Ireland, which went really well, and now we have expanded the program to India, Waldorf in Germany, and 2 locations in the US. The locations that we have chosen are where all of our research and development labs are located, because that's the area where we've identified we're going to most benefit from this program, and where we can really give back to Specialist Stern. So it's early days now. We're calling it the incubation stage at the moment, and the feedback from our employees has been fantastic. There's a huge level of interest in the program, and we're very happy that we're on track to the commitment that we've made and the milestones to 2020.
And I suppose when you start to think about that different skill set and that different pool of talent, what implication does that have back to your internal recruitment processes?
It was very different. There were many of areas that we needed to look at. What we found was that we needed to identify a local sponsor in each location that we went live. Somebody who had an affinity with the topic. What we found is most of the leads that we have for these programs have a familiarity with the topic. They either have a family member or a child with autism, so they're already they're very interested in getting involved in the program. Every team that embarked on this, that was welcoming one of these new employees into their team, needed to go through autism awareness training to make sure that they were fully aware and fully equipped with all the skills that they needed to make sure that this new employee was going to be set up for success with SAP. One of the added benefits that we found was actually around communication. It's quite a surprise how much sarcasm you use in your everyday speech. You don't even realize that you're being sarcastic. Autistic people don't understand sarcasm. So that had to be removed from the conversation. So communication had to be very clear. One-line emails didn't cut it anymore. So the feedback we've had from the teams has been overall the communication with the entire team has been so much more improved, and it's been a real added benefit for the team. Planning was also very key. Like many organizations, in IT it's a fast-paced organization. We change direction, change strategy, change focus on projects, depending on what's happening in the market. Autistic employees don't react as favorably to change, so we needed to really plan the projects that they were going to be working on or development areas. And when there was a change in direction, that change had to be mapped very, very clearly to make that transition as comfortable a process as possible. The other key area, obviously from a talent acquisition perspective, was interviewing. A standard behavioral-based interview is not going to showcase the talents of an autistic candidate to their best advantage. So this is a real learning experience for us, and Specialist Stern really helped us through this process. So if you think of a standard behavioural-based interview, you're going to be sitting across a table from somebody having a normal conversation. If you look at the interview process that we go through for Autism at Work, you'll enter a room, there'll be tables full of Lego blocks, and basically the challenge is it's a hands-on challenge, and the candidates will be creating and building a toy robot out of the Lego blocks. So it gives an insight into how they approach a task, how they're structured in their thinking. So it's very different. It's been a fantastic learning experience for us. I mean, it's still early days and we're learning all the time, and we'll continue to build and improve what we're doing as time progresses, but it's been a fantastic experience to date.
Yeah, it's incredibly inspiring, and I mean, I think we'd almost have a session on that on alone, but we may come back to visit that. I want to welcome Nick to our session today. Nick, part of Department of Defence and heading up the recruitment team there as part of the RPO, I think you put it. Yep. Now, being a consumer of television, I've seen all the ads on TV, the Army and the Navy. It certainly feels like there's some good gender balance there in the advertisements. It's obviously a huge initiative there for the Department of Defence.
It's probably not even a balance at the moment. If you watch your average ads, it's quite much harder to find the males in the background rather than the females, which are very much up front and centre. And that's been a very much known and planned initiative by the Australian Defence Force. They would like to increase the number of women serving across Army, Navy and Air Force. And they believe it to be that there will be additional capability through that better balance. So that's really the key thing that's driving it. They want to be far more representative of the population. When they first started the initiative, only 10% of people in the Army were female. And obviously that's not anywhere near 50% of the population. So there's been a lot of work to focus on the recruitment, which is obviously where we're really focusing on, and also internally the ADF is focused on retention to really look at supporting women in all avenues of a defence career.
When I think about, there's sort of two parts to this. There's the one part which is, it's a product that you have to market and position, right, as a career. So first part of that is, what changes did you have to make to the recruitment process, or did you have to make any at all to start to meet some of these goals or needs?
So there wasn't necessarily changes in the recruitment process or the requirements. The requirements are exactly the same, but when it comes to understanding the market, that's what we first did. So we did a ground-up sort of look at all our recruitment process and the experiences that women have had through our process over the last number of years. And we looked at, okay, so women only represent 25% of our inquiries. That's obviously an issue. We need to look at how we can recruit more. What about other parts of the process? Well, aptitude, they're equal or better than their male counterparts. At psych testing, they're equal or better. At medical testing, there's no difference there either. And at their selection boards, there's no difference there. But what it did encounter, one of the other barriers was fitness. Everyone who joins needs to pass a fitness test before at the end of their recruitment process, and we came to the conclusion, it was very clear that around 30% of women were failing one aspect of that fitness test. And to give you an idea, if you want to join the Army, your fitness test is you need to do 8 push-ups, 45 sit-ups, and a shuttle run at 7.5 on the beep test of the shuttle run. So that was clean as a key barrier. And as everyone sort of knows, you look at the things that you can change and the things that you can't change. So obviously if they're psych or medically unsuitable, that's something that is not up to us to change or do anything about. But when it comes to fitness, that's something that we can work and work with them to try and improve. And when it comes to increasing the rate of inquiries, that's what we've done with I suppose, the changing of the marketing messages.
Yeah. You mentioned when we caught up, we spent some time talking, and there's the messaging, which is controlled obviously by the advertising agency, We spoke a little bit about the candidate experience, and you mentioned that actually the calibre and the type of people within your recruitment team. Was that something that you looked at?
Yeah, that's certainly something we looked at. One of the other drop-off points we looked at was at the very first stage. So they've said, yes, I'm looking at joining, so they'll sign up for a U session and they'll wander into the Defence Force Recruiting Centre and, yes, I'm all keen, and they'll leave, and then they won't move to the next stage, regardless of how successful they've been. And so we looked at what are the factors that go along with that. And then you start to look at there was a lot more consideration going on. So if you think of the maturity levels of a 17, 18-year-old male versus the maturity of a 17, 18-year-old female, there's a bit of a difference there.
We're all nodding.
The women are going to think about things a lot more. So they're going to give a lot more consideration. And in that time, they considered and they looked at other options. And so we looked at, well, maybe they didn't get their preference, or maybe they rolled in and looked at one of the roles, but it wasn't recruiting at that time. So they went away and found something else. So one of the options was to try and really give them more options right there and then and capture it at that stage. And certainly one of the other ones is coming up with some ambassadors. So there, in conjunction with Defence, there are 20 serving female ADF recruiting staff around the country, and so they become ambassadors for the Australian Defence Force. So they'll have specific marketing events, so women in Army breakfasts, women in Navy breakfasts, where you can go and you can interact and you can find out, okay, what actually is it like? I've heard stories, but what actually is it like face to face?
I mentioned earlier my first experience was working with a manufacturer and the challenges of trying to, in a male-dominated workplace, get females into there. And you're in a similar situation, but you actually have an extra challenge because there's actually obviously some, public awareness of some of the challenges in some of those environments. And a career is really about trust. Can you share anything around that and how you think about that from a recruitment perspective?
I think in terms of just, it is about understanding your market and that branding. So things that, the messages that you'll see in the ads are obviously targeted differently. What targets a male person looking to join the ADF? It might be adventure, it might be the chance to play with big toys, whereas a female might be more along the lines of career progression, the equality, and travel and so forth. And then there's some things that work across both, such as mateship. And you'll see the advertising and the messaging being quite specific and targeted. So that's, I suppose, one of the ways that we're trying to combat that. When it comes to direct initiatives, there are female-specific targets that we have, or roles that we have to fill, and they're set out for the organisation to strive after and really try and get. But if at the end of the day we can't find a female to fill that role, then capability is number one, and we'll fill that role with any of the men that are waiting.
Yeah, back to that sort of same example I'm using as a bit of the glue here, but one of the challenges we had with the union was that there was an issue about marketing to women because of the labour force and they were unionised. And when you think about some of the roles you've identified for females, is there any consideration there around how you approach that and how do you focus on females but yet?
Yeah, look, that one's fairly easy to answer. So the Australian Defence Force has set in stone that from January 2016, all roles will be available for females at recruitment level. So from 2013, if you are currently serving, you've been able to transfer across to any of those roles, but in the future you can see we're currently recruiting for female fast jet pilots now. So we're currently recruiting for female clearance divers. So the opportunity is there for females to get into those roles if they meet the requirements, and that's really the key driver for this push for diversity.
Yeah, and I suppose there's, with that such targeted advertising, there's a need to make sure that that level of trust, there's a consistency when it comes through that candidate care, that there is, transparency in what we're saying is actually what we can deliver on.
Absolutely, and when you sort of come and start the process, there is that face-to-face genuine approach. So you're face-to-face with uniform members of the ADF. You have the opportunity to ask questions in the same way as was mentioned in their New Zealand presentation. We've got a huge YouTube channel. We've got the #1 recruitment YouTube channel globally in terms of number of views. So we've done that same thing in terms of, this is Tom. Tom's a truck driver. This is what Tom does. And then the same for, this is Jane. She, is a maritime warfare officer, and follows through the positives and negatives of those things. So people can interact. People can actively sort of see for themselves, and then start to find out more.
And is it a case of success breeds success? Like, are you seeing, is the data suggesting you're tracking in the right way, that the things that you're putting in place?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's like anything. If you draw a box around it, you start to measure it, you start to focus on it, and you resource it, then you will see growth. So certainly in the space of the last 12 months, the percentages have increased by about 1.5%.
Yep.
When you're talking a workforce of tens of thousands, that's a significant result. So it's certainly working.
Terrific. Finuala, when we caught up, once again, fascinating to listen about diversity, but in particular gender diversity. And when we spoke, you shared about that when you start to look at it and want to focus in a different way, the importance of actually helping people see the ROI, the why are you doing this? Why do we need to change? Can you share a little bit insight of that journey that you went to when it came to gender diversity at
Sure.
SAP?
I suppose the catalyst for change for SAP, we've been focused on diversity for a number of years, but the catalyst for change is the legislation being introduced into Germany in 2017, which says that 25% of all managers within the business must be female. So absolutely rock hard target we have to hit. It doesn't just affect us in Germany, it affects us globally. So you can imagine there's a laser focus on this in the company. But when you start to position diversity and inclusion when the conversation happened, it can't be a program that HR is pushing. This is a D&I initiative we're going to push out and you're all going to get involved in it. You're just not going to get the traction that you needed. You needed people everybody, the leaders within the organization, to really embrace this and take it as their own. So we were thinking, how do we position this? How do we build the business case to position for each leader within the organization to own this topic? So we started to look at all the external research to get all the facts and tangible positives that we could put into play. And there are some absolutely fantastic discussion points to build into your business case. We know that diverse management teams have a 48% higher operating margin. Well, if you're running a P&L, that's something you're going to be definitely interested in. We know that 85% of enterprises agree that a diversity and inclusive workforce generate more innovative ideas. For a software enterprise company, if we don't innovate in our development, we're not going to continue to be as successful. So real tangible benefit. We know that 39% of management teams who are diverse, they've got a 39% higher customer satisfaction rate, and productivity is 22% higher. And if you talk to any organization, most organizations are grappling with productivity, because with lower costs, productivity has to increase. And it's a real business benefit you can take and talk to a sales leader about. We're a publicly listed company. We know that on the Diversity Inc. index, the top 50 diverse companies outperform stock exchanges globally by 25%. I mean, that's an absolute tangible benefit. And we know within organizations, we've talked about war for talent and how challenging it is to find real talent in the market. So if you're a manager and you're losing people out of your team through attrition, you should be seriously concerned about it. So now as a manager, you most impact your employees' engagement through diversity and inclusive initiatives. So there are real key benefits that we could build in and talk to. Why are you doing this? It's not a nice to have. This is going to make you more successful in your career. This is going to make the company more successful. So we really started to build that into the talk track for the business. We also needed to look at education, because if you talk to one person about diversity and inclusion, they may have a very different understanding to talking to somebody else. So we really looked at education programs across the board. And we looked at one program which is called Women and Men Leading Together, which was a fantastic program. And it's a program that everybody in the company is going through. And what I really liked about the program is the fact that it focuses on the complementary skills within the genders, rather than any conflicting skills. And really went into a lot of detail around this. Went into the chemical and biological makeup of each gender's brains and how that impacts everything. Communication, how you manage stress, leadership style, how you manage your teams, and really blew out of the water a lot of the myths out there, which I think was a really healthy thing to do. If you think of diversity, it's a very mature topic in Australia, for example. If you think of having the same conversation in Japan, it's a very different conversation. So blowing a lot of those myths out of the water was very helpful. It also gave managers very practical tips. So if you're a manager and you're running a team meeting, you've got a diverse management team or diverse team sitting in your meeting room, your female employee may not be the first person to put up their hand. It doesn't mean that they don't have fantastic ideas. All it means is they may not be the first person to put up their hand. So if you're a manager, you need to be aware of that and ensure that you are being inclusive in your management style to make sure that you're getting the best from your employees. There was, it was a 2-day training course that we went through, and there was a lot of aha moments, and some of the people who'd attended the course came out saying, much better understanding of why my husband, but if I ask him what he's thinking about, he says nothing. I can't understand that, but now I know he's gone into his man cave to recharge and get back to focusing on what he needs to do. So that was a tangible benefit. One of the other things that we looked at was attrition. So there's a war for talent. Everybody knows that. And if you lose somebody out of your team, it's a huge cost to the business. It puts extra pressure on your own organization or your own team carrying the workload till you backfill, and a massive loss of IP. So when we were looking at this topic, we started to obviously study the attrition stats that we had globally. One area really stood out. We've got a R&D facility in India, in Bangalore. It's a large facility. There's over 5,500 developers in there. And because of the number of engineers that graduate in India every year, we've got a very healthy gender balance within that area, which is fantastic. But we had a huge spike in attrition within the female workforce after a couple of years. And we started to look into this in more detail, and it was when they went on mat leave. So we were losing over 30% of our female employees when they went on maternity leave. Massive loss of IP to the business. So when we investigated this in more detail, we were very happy to find out that it wasn't a lack of desire to return to the workforce. It was the fact that they couldn't find quality childcare close to the office. So they couldn't return to work. Now, we are very fortunate that we do have a large labs facility campus in Bangalore. So we made the decision as a company that we'd build a childcare centre on site. And we did that in 2010. We expected, obviously, this to impact our retention figures, but we were really pleasantly surprised at the impact it had. We've now got a 98% return ratio when women go on mat leave, which is brilliant. It's open for all employees, of course, but what I really liked is the message that is sent to all of our employees in terms of how valuable each and every employee is and how much we actually want you to return to work and support you through various life stages. So that was also something that we built into the business case in terms of education, tangible business benefits, and how you actually protect your team in terms of retention. Yeah,
terrific. And as I said, I feel each one of these stories, I feel I could spend all day talking about this. It really is amazing. Gem, going back to Indigenous, but when we think about gender and then we think about Indigenous, is there nuances that we need to think about or be aware about when we look at recruiting Indigenous talent?
Yeah, certainly. At AIME, our breakdown actually looks quite nice on paper. We have, of our Indigenous staff, 63% of them are female. In terms of protocols, it really depends on the area or the region that you're recruiting in. There are definitely some around eye contact and clothing and how many people can be in certain rooms. Most people are fairly relaxed about it, but the right thing to do, and I think the respectful thing to do, is to contact your local lands council, and they'll be able to talk you through sort of the do's and don'ts of a particular area, and that's something that, yeah, we think is pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually have 4 minutes left of the session. I did want to leave some time to open to questions if anyone would like to ask one of our panellists a question. We have, I believe, roaming mics there from our good friends there at LinkedIn.
We can just start doing the ad for fitness test if you want.
I can start off because I've written down a couple. I spoke earlier and I started off in talking about communication. when we start to understand what that value proposition is, how did any of your organisations, so we heard a little bit about defence, but with SAP, was there a shift in how you started to communicate why work at SAP when you started to really focus on the value of diversity?
So when we looked at all the research and we were looking at the diversity topic, one of the things that we consulted the external research as well, one of the things that really jumped out at us was how different each gender approaches the hiring process. I mean, every facet of the hiring process.
Yeah.
So in terms of communication, as an example, if you have a male candidate looking at a job description, normal job description, start at most hiring processes, and might have 7 core requirements for that role. If a male candidate looks at that job description, has 60% of the requirements, he's going to confidently apply for that role and feel he's got a good chance of getting the job. On the flip side, if a female candidate is in the same position looking at that job description and has 90% of the requirements for that role, they're likely not to apply for the position because they're not confident that they've got 100% of what's needed. So we're losing candidates before we even become aware of them. And interestingly, it's exactly the same behaviour we see for female candidates internally and externally. So from a communication perspective, we had to look at every single step of the hiring process, and writing job descriptions completely change, excuse me, completely change how we wrote the job description. So we're removing as much as we possibly could the option to opt out of actually applying, to make them more open in terms of being more inclusive, so females will actually apply for the roles.
We've got similar examples where Defence come up with some interesting titles for roles. Personal Capability Officer is one. If you talk to people in the audience, what is a personal capability? So no one knew what it was, so no one was interested in applying for it. If you therefore put an ad, or if you call it administration officer, oh, I know how to do that. Yeah, I'm going to apply for that. So it's those sort of simple things, just in terms of naming and branding and doing some checks and finding out from your audience that does make a big difference.
One of the things I've done before is actually, when you're looking to increase, in particular gender, I've actually interviewed females who are doing that job to say, well, how do you describe the job? Like if you were to talk to the job outside to a friend, and how would you describe the type of person that you need? And if they use words like, well, you have to be practically minded, etc., then they're the key words you really need to use in your communications to help someone self-select. If that's me, can I do that?
Yeah. Which is surely what all the conversations around passive candidates that have been had in LinkedIn's, promotes, that when you approach somebody that way and you're approaching them, they build that confidence, and that's why referral systems, emails are really an essential tool for any sort of diversity that you want in your organisation.
Terrific. Would you please welcome and thank you, my guests, for a really insightful session today on diversity.